Hello, Ken. Thank you for coming on. I'm honored for your presence.
No, my pleasure. It's very good to be here.
So let's go straight to our conversation. You've led the Human Rights Watch for 30 years until November 2022,
October 22.
buil-
Yeah.
building it into one of the world's most influential human rights organization. Could you take us back to the beginning? Like, how did it start? And even before, what drew you to human rights in the first place?
But first, beginning with myself, I mean, I was very much drawn to the human rights cause because of the experience of my father. My father grew up in Nazi Germany and fled Frankfurt as a 12-year-old boy in July 1938. And so I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up with stories about what it was like to be a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis, worried about what would happen with the brown shirts at the playground, worried about whether his father would be arrested. So, these were stories that made me very aware of the evil that governments can do. And is a big part of what drove me to devote my career to trying to prevent a recurrence of that kind of evil. Now, Human Rights Watch began actually with the Helsinki Accords of 1975, which authorized for the first time groups in the former Soviet Union to monitor the human rights practices of their governments. And small groups were set up in Moscow and Warsaw and Prague. They were all promptly suppressed, thrown in prison, and they issued a call to the West to create Helsinki monitoring groups to try to protect them. And that gave rise, excuse me, that gave rise to Helsinki Watch, which was the precursor of Human Rights Watch. And over time, it became global. It went from Helsinki Watch, America's Watch, Asia Watch, etc. And then about the time that I joined the organization in the late 80s, it began using the term Human Rights Watch to
But you got
describe the work effort. Yes. So I was, yeah, and I graduated from Yale Law School, 1980. And I was very interested in doing human rights work, but there was virtually no field at that stage. I signed up for the one course offered at the law school. It was canceled. So to this day, I've never taken a formal course in Human Rights Watch or in human rights. I mean, even though I teach two courses at Princeton, I then went into a non-existent job market. Human Rights Watch at that stage had 2 employees. And so I started off working as a lawyer, mainly as a federal prosecutor, and volunteering nights and weekends doing human rights work, focusing at that point mainly on the declaration of martial law in Poland as part of the Soviet-backed effort to crush the Solidarity trade union movement. And that got me going. It was exhilarating. It was I found it very fulfilling. And finally, when a job opened up in 1987 at Human Rights Watch, I jumped at it and was there for more than 3 decades.
you have a very interesting phrase in your book, Righting Wrongs, that you and you use a comparison with the technology billionaires that were born in the right moment in
Yes.
normally 1955, and then went on to grow with the
Yeah.
tech
Yeah.
movement. Yeah.
What I describe is how the evolution of communications technology very much traced the evolution of the human rights movement. And I describe this in the book because, in the early days when, information traveled by steamship, the only way to learn about things was, over a long period of time. And so the human rights movement needed to address big, long lasting problems like the slave trade or women's suffrage. But over time, first with the telegraph, then with cheaper international phone calls, then with email, today with social media and smartphones, it became easier to learn about things quickly. And that changed the metabolism of the human rights movement. It enabled us to, learn about something today and seek to stop it tomorrow. And that was, transformative. And, I compare myself in the book to a bunch of people who were tech moguls who happened to be born in 1955, which is when I was born. Somebody like Bill Gates was in there on the ground floor just as this technology was taking off. And he, became a leader, a billionaire. Now, I'm obviously not a billionaire, but I, in many ways, um, benefited from the same trend because I took over Human Rights Watch just as email emerged. I actually once got a special grant that I devoted to creating email capacity at Human Rights Watch when nobody had it. And that, enabled us to move much more quickly, much more easily. And in a sense, I was also a beneficiary of these technological innovations that turned the human rights movement into a quicker and much more powerful movement that is what it is today.
Yeah, with the access to the information much faster, much easier. Yeah, I imagine that it was completely transforming. And over your career, you have investigated, documented, and reported on war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide. What does that process look like on the ground?
Well, I mean, the beginning of the work that Human Rights Watch does, it always starts with a careful investigation on the ground. We try to go to the scene of the crime, or if we can't go there, we go as near as we can. And we try to speak to the survivors, to the eyewitnesses, to anybody with firsthand information, including the government. And we try to put together as complete and accurate a picture as we can of what the human rights violations were. That then begins really a three-part process to try to put pressure on governments to change. One is we start with the fact that in today's world, every government pretends to respect human rights. This is a basic matter of their legitimacy. It's a way of saying, look, we look out for the people, not just ourselves. Now, the reality is far worse. And when we can investigate, report on, and then spotlight that discrepancy between the haughty pretenses and the ugly reality, it's embarrassing. It's shameful. It's delegitimizing. And governments go to great lengths to try to avoid it. And so that enables us to, in a sense, raise the reputational cost of human rights violations. Second, we will go to influential governments that purport to uphold human rights in their foreign policy. And we recognize that in today's world, every despot, every dictator wants something from the international community. We try to prevent them from getting it until they change for the better. And so we will go to, any government that has influence and say, would you withhold the thing that the target government wants? It could be arms sales, it could be, preferential trade benefits, it could be an invitation to a summit. Withhold that until they've taken these following steps to improve their human rights record. And that, then adds a diplomatic and economic price to human rights violations. And then the third thing we do in extreme cases, we try to get people prosecuted. We will send evidence to the International Criminal Court or to national courts using universal jurisdiction, and we will try to ensure that people are charged, tried, convicted, and sentenced for their most serious human rights violations. And everybody wants to avoid prison. So that is, again, a powerful tool. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does happen, everybody pays attention. So that's the essence of the work that Human Rights Watch does.
But what happens when you are, for example, barred from entering the country? When the government does not allow for human rights organizations to even enter, in order to investigate?
Yeah, I mean, this happens regularly where governments try to cover up their human rights crimes, and that doesn't stop us. And there are lots of ways you can get information remotely if you can't get to the scene of the crime. One obvious method is you can call people up who were there, talk to them on WhatsApp. You can interview people who were there but have fled, who are refugees or displaced people, and who you can reach. These days, we also increasingly use tools of remote monitoring of, open source analysis. So if something significant happens in people's lives, they tend to take a picture of it, post it on social media. That is potentially evidence. So we can scrape social media. We have to verify this to make sure it's not disinformation. But if we can verify it, this is a way of proving what happened. We also have a partnership with a satellite imagery company called Planet that takes a picture of the entire globe every single day. And so for issues, of a certain size, a certain visibility, we can just ask for pictures from the sky. And that's another way to document it. So, what we found is that there often is a way, there's almost always a way to find out what's happening, even if a government tries to block us and cover up.
You also said in your book, and this phrase is, I found it very interesting, that the first point of such reporting is to shame the perpetrators, tarnishing their reputations while generating pressure for change. How does that strategy work in practice? And could you give any example in your long career that you had to use this tool in order to achieve a goal?
Well, sure. I mean, every government cares about its reputation, in part because it's a way of showing the people at home that they're respected. If they may be despised at home, but if they can show that the international community likes them, that raises their stature at home. So that's part of it. But also, as I said, governments want things from the international community And having a better reputation makes it easier to get those things. And so, I opened the book with the discussion of Idlib in northwestern Syria. And I chose that because it was such a difficult case. And I wanted to show that even in a difficult case, you can make a difference. So this was, a situation where the Assad government was doing everything imaginable. It was using chemical weapons. It was using barrel bombs against civilians. It was detaining, torturing, executing, and disappearing people. It had no reputation left. And in Idlib, it was bombing hospitals, schools, apartment buildings, marketplaces, a war crime strategy to try to drive out the civilian population. There were about 3 million civilians there. And they figured if they could get rid of the civilians, it was easier to go after the rebels. They would, drain the sea to get the fish. And so in a situation like this, we have to look around and say, well, what does Assad care about? And what he cared about was Russian military support. Without Russian military support, Assad would have been toppled long ago. And so we decided to target Putin. And that was not as crazy as it sounds, because when we started doing this, it was before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin still cared about his reputation. And so we couldn't go to Washington because Trump was in power. Trump was not going to pressure Putin. But we decided to go to Germany, France, and Turkey, and to focus on Merkel, Macron, and Erdogan. And over the course of 2 to 3 years, with repeated meetings and work with the media in these countries, we were able to raise the issue of Idlib high enough on their agenda so they, in turn, arm-twisted Putin to finally stop. In March 2020, he agreed to stop. And for 3 years, the bombing of civilians ended. It picked up a little bit after that, but then Idlib is where the HTS rebel group came from, which overthrew Assad in December. And so basically it ended definitively. And that illustrates how, even in a horrible situation, a very difficult situation, the combination of careful documentation of what's happening combined with deployment of that information in areas that matter can move a recalcitrant government.
So it all has to be very strategic, and even though the government itself may be shameless, let's use this word, you can go against it in other ways, right?
It's exactly. There's always an angle. There's always something that can work. You just have to figure out what it is. And a big part of the human rights movement is this kind of strategizing to figure out where do we have the leverage and how do we pursue this to force the government to change. Now, this is not a matter of just sort of sitting around and hoping for the best. It's a matter of playing hardball and really changing the cost-benefit analysis behind the repression.
Relating to this case in the first chapter in your book, you also explain it that how Russia and China vetoes paralyzed the UN Security Council in the case of Syria, during its chemical attacks and bombing. Today, we see that, for example, the US plays a similar role regarding Palestine. Do you believe that this post-war World War II structure of the Security Council must be rethought for the international system to fight impunity and promote peace, removing its double standards?
Well, look, I think we all recognize that the UN Security Council is paralyzed these days because of the veto. So, Russia and China protect their dictators, the US protects Israel. It's not working. But that doesn't mean you have to give up, because there are other parts of the UN where there is no veto. And I described in the book how we would go to the General Assembly, or we would very frequently go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and get them to act in ways that really made a difference. And so, with Syria, when Russia and China vetoed sending Syria to the UN, to the International Criminal Court, we were able to persuade the UN General Assembly to create basically a special prosecutor to collect the evidence and analyze it and make it available for national courts exercising universal jurisdiction, which has now happened in over 100 cases. And there are a series of cases, including the conviction in Koblenz in Germany of a senior Syrian official who oversaw a torture and execution camp. So this is beginning to work. At the UN Human Rights Council, we regularly get it to adopt measures that the superpowers don't like. I describe how we successfully, working with the Netherlands and a group of European governments, persuaded the Human Rights Council to create essentially a commission of inquiry. It was called a group of eminent experts that investigated and reported on the Saudi-led coalition's bombing of civilians in Yemen. And it existed for 4 years and made a huge difference, because when it was finally lifted under Saudi pressure, the civilian casualties doubled in Yemen. And it showed how this kind of scrutiny, it may seem like, oh, who cares? It's just a bunch of reports. But in fact, everybody behaves better when they're watched. And if we can get the UN through one of these bodies where there is no veto to act, it can make a huge difference in saving people's lives.
And was there any time where you almost met one of the leaders of the government to discuss this kind of human rights violations and then ended up not following through because of political reasons?
No, I mean, I was pretty much willing to meet with anybody, because it was an opportunity to speak to them frankly. The dictators tend to surround themselves by sycophants. And I could walk in there. I didn't have to worry about them arresting me. I could speak honestly to them. And I could, show that their efforts to cover up and to spin reality was not working, that we saw through this. And I could, I would hope to shake them up so they would leave the meeting and begin to wonder whether they maybe do have to change their human rights practices. That was the aim. Now, the one case I describe in the book, which I didn't go through with a meeting on, and I actually regret it in retrospect, is a proposed meeting with Assad in Syria. And my staff just worried that Assad would portray it as, somehow positive for his awful human rights record. I wasn't worried about that because I knew it took just a day to get from Damascus to Beirut. We could hold a press conference in Beirut. We could undo, any lies that Assad told. But I deferred to the staff and it didn't go through with that meeting. But other than that, I really would meet with anybody I could, including some awful individuals. And sometimes it made a difference. I mean, I described meeting with the Egyptian military junta that took power after Mubarak was toppled in the Arab Spring uprising in Tahrir Square. And this was an awful group of people. And I went into the meeting and they just started yelling at me. They thought that they would sort of bludgeon us into acquiescing into their rule. And I pushed back. And the place where I made the biggest difference, I think, was they were doing so-called virginity tests of female protesters, which are these intrusive, humiliating, utterly unnecessary tests, just to, punish them. And they said, oh, we're doing this to protect these women from being raped in custody. And I said, oh, you mean so if the women have had sex, it's okay if they're raped in custody? And the guy had no idea. He was like completely taken aback. And by the end of the meeting, he promised to end the virginity tests. And the next day we held a press conference to lock him in. So it shows that, even with a group of thugs who just think they're going to yell at me, you can find a way to make a difference. We had something similar happen in Libya under the Gaddafi government, where Gaddafi was trying to kind of improve his international reputation, and he had stopped supporting terrorism and dismantled his nuclear program and, taken a number of positive steps. But the big open question was his human rights record. And so he invited Human Rights Watch in. We were given access to the prisons. We interviewed a bunch of people. The one condition was we promised that we would show the government a copy of the report before we issued it. So I went to Tripoli to present the report. And again, we met with a bunch of government officials and they started yelling at us. And they said, oh, you completely misunderstood. This is so wrong. You got to withdraw the report. And I let them go on for a little bit. And then finally I said, look, you guys don't understand. We are releasing this report at a press conference in Cairo in a few days. And the journalists are going to ask us, how were your meetings in Tripoli? And I can say, oh, they were terrible. All they did was yell at us. Or I can say they were very productive and they've promised the following reforms. Which should it be? This took them back. And so they said, we have to consult with our superiors. And they dismissed us. We hung around the next morning. Finally, we got word they were willing to see us. We walked in and it was like a different government. They were all smiles. They had stacks of folders on their desk of the various cases we wanted to examine. And we gave them a list of 171 political prisoners. And within a few weeks, they were all released. So it shows that, if you can stand up to these awful governments and find something they care about, you can move them.
So the practice was always first present the report and then have a press conference to announce it and to explain all the details.
Yes. And the press conference is important because, a report is just a report. Not that many people read the report. But if you can get the media to cover it, then everybody sees it. And when I left Human Rights Watch, we were getting 1,000 media mentions every single day. So that meant we were able to shine a very intense spotlight on governmental abuse that did great damage to their reputation and is a big part of why they ultimately had to change.
Okay. Very interesting tactic. Yeah, it's all diplomacy and strategy, I see.
Yes, exactly. exactly.
So, going forward, also in your book, you made a strong statement that there is no greater threat to global human rights system than the Chinese government under Xi Jinping. Could you further explain this?
Yes. Now, what I didn't say is that China is the worst human rights violator. It's up there. What it's done to the Uyghurs, detaining 1 million of them to force them to abandon their religion, their culture, their language. I mean, this is awful. It's a crime against humanity. Some people say it's genocide. But there are, other comparably abusive governments. But where China stands alone is that it is the only government that is trying to change the global human rights system. And it's doing it in two ways. First, it's trying to rewrite human rights law. So, human rights standards are codified in a series of treaties that most governments have ratified. China would just dispense with all of that and substitute a very simplistic three-part test. It would say, one, are people happy, which is meaningless in China because there's no independent polling. Two, is there stability, which means for China just is there repression? Do they keep the lid on? And third, the real issue, is the economy growing? Is GDP per capita increasing? And it has been for most, for the last couple of decades in China. It's slowing down right now. But Xi Jinping basically says, look, if people are economically better off, leave me alone. That's all I have to worry about. Now, that is a radical dumbing down of human rights standards. It means that people have no ability to influence how their government conducts itself. There's no free press. There's no independent political parties. There's no right to protest. But it also means that they have no say in, or there's no duty on the government to use its resources to benefit the worst off segments of society, which is what the concept of economic rights requires. And so, they don't want people asking how the Uyghurs are doing or how the Tibetans are doing or even how are rural Han Chinese doing, because they're all doing terribly. The government just wants to say, is the economic pie growing? They don't want you to ask how they divide up the pie. And so this really decimates human rights standards. It leaves no room for the individual. It's all about the collective, even though human rights are about what responsibility the collective has to the individual. Then, to make matters worse, the Chinese government would change the way the United Nations operates. And so at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which these days, will investigate, report, condemn abusive governments, China wants to stop all of that and just have nice, pleasant conversations among governments about how each is finding its own unique path to respect human rights. Utterly deferential, no pressure. And so, the end result of this, if China were to prevail, is you would have no more human rights standards of any meaning and no pressure to conform to the old human rights standards. So that's why I view the Chinese government as the greatest threat to the global human rights system. Nobody else is attempting this radical revision.
And how does a human rights organization conduct its own investigation if, for example, it's very hard for conducted in person in China specifically because there's a repression of
Yeah.
press and
Yeah, I mean, it's the same techniques of remote monitoring that I described earlier, which is to say, you can speak to people who are in Xinjiang. It still is possible to talk to them on WhatsApp. You can speak to people who have left Xinjiang about what their lives were like. You can use remote monitoring, satellite imagery and the like. And so it is very possible to find out what's going on. You can often just look at government documents. It's amazing how much the government posts online because, when you have a country as vast and complicated as China, they need to kind of control the bureaucracy. And a lot of interesting data is publicly available. China tries to cover it up, but it doesn't succeed with everything. And I describe, almost humorous example where the Chinese equivalent of Google Maps under Baidu, the major social media company in China, people worried, some bureaucrat worried that investigators could just look at Baidu maps and find the detention centers for Uyghurs. So they started kind of whiting out the detention centers. And then you could just look at the maps for the areas that were whited out and find the detention centers. And so it shows that when you have, a dictatorship, when there's no free discussion, the bureaucracy makes mistakes and investigators can exploit those mistakes.
And pertaining to the Uyghur situation, how have you found that Western countries and even the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation reacted to these well-documented education camps, repressive camps?
Well, I mean, let me answer that in two parts if I could. I mean, first, at the level of condemnation, Western governments have been good about condemning the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has been horrible. The only Muslim majority states that have been willing to criticize China's treatment of Uyghur Muslims have been Turkey, Albania, and Bosnia. That's it. Nobody else says anything. And, so you've got Pakistan, Indonesia, Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, major, powerful Muslim majority countries that just ignore the Uyghurs because they're afraid of upsetting the Chinese government. So there's been, I think, a complete abdication of responsibility toward these governments' Muslim brethren just because they are succumbing to economic pressure from China. Now, with respect to Western governments, as I said, they've been good about condemning. The big issue now is whether they are going to address China's widespread use of Uyghur forced labor. And here the US government actually has been good. They have adopted a law that presumptively bans any import from Xinjiang because of the likelihood that it's tainted by Uyghur forced labor. But other Western governments throughout Europe, the UK, Canada, Australia, they have not created a presumption like this. Instead, they just have abstract policies saying we oppose forced labor, which is nice. But when you say, well, why are you letting these goods in from Xinjiang? They would say, oh, well, we don't have any evidence that they were produced with Uyghur forced labor because the Chinese government blocks investigations. And the value of the presumption is that it turns the tables. It says that if China is going to prevent independent investigations, then presumptively we're going to treat these goods as the product of Uyghur forced labor. And it takes a presumption like that to make a theoretical objection to forced labor into something meaningful. Europe has not been willing to take that step.
Yeah, so the burden of proof goes to the Chinese government or Chinese companies that need to demonstrate that the products were not produced by Uyghur labor force.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're the importer, you can just plead ignorance. I don't know about any forced labor, and they don't because nobody knows about anything. But we do know that widespread, that the use of Uyghur forced labor is widespread in Xinjiang. So therefore, to make a ban on forced labor real, you've got to presumptively bar any imports from Xinjiang. That's what the US government has done. Other Western governments should follow that lead.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense, 100%. Going to something that I read in your book regarding landmines, and Human Rights Watch was a key force behind the landmine ban and cluster ammunition treaties. What do you think that those campaigns taught you about the role of human rights groups in international law and how fundamental they are?
There are two big lessons that I draw from the landmines campaign. One is that it's important not to let military lawyers have a monopoly in how you interpret international humanitarian law, which is traditionally what they did. The only people who knew enough about humanitarian law were the people who worked for these militaries, plus the International Committee of the Red Cross, but the ICRC operated confidentially. And so Human Rights Watch was the first human rights organization that began to focus on humanitarian law, beginning with the armed conflicts, the civil wars in Central America in the mid-1980s. And what we did was introduce public pressure. We exposed these decisions. And the landmines campaign showed how this works. International law had a theoretical ban on indiscriminate warfare. It said, you can't just bomb people indiscriminately, you've got to target military targets. Landmines were classic indiscriminate weapons. They had no idea who was stepping on them. Could be a soldier, but it could be, a woman collecting firewood, it could be a child playing. It had no idea. It was indiscriminate. And so Human Rights Watch and a few colleague organizations did a series of reports describing the ongoing effect of landmines long after a conflict where they were killing and maiming people. And we basically made the case, this is indiscriminate warfare, and built a campaign initially with a global coalition of NGOs, then with a global coalition of governments, about 60 small and medium-sized governments that were able to prevail despite the opposition of Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Delhi, a number of superpowers. And so the two lessons here, one is it's important to break the monopoly of the military lawyers, that when you introduce public opinion, you can interpret standards in a way that is more protective of civilians. And second, just because the superpowers oppose some human rights initiative doesn't mean you lose. That if you put together a broad coalition, it has the political and moral clout to prevail. And that's why Human Rights Watch shared in the Nobel Peace Prize for that landmines campaign because of the success of this effort.
Yeah. So, but were the countries all around the world accepted? Did the countries accept it straight away, or it was a battle for others in order for them to sign the treaty?
Well, it took a while to put together a coalition. And initially the negotiations were taking place in Geneva under sort of an obscure treaty known as the Convention on Conventional Weapons. And the rules there were you needed unanimity to move anything forward. Anybody could object. It was like the Security Council, but worse, because everybody had a veto. And the negotiations were going nowhere. And so what we were able to do was persuade Canada and Norway in particular to move the negotiations out of Geneva and to set up what was known as the Ottawa process, where the veto rules were not applied. People could come and negotiate if they wanted a treaty. But if they wanted to block a treaty, they should stay in Geneva. And that ended up working. We were able to push the treaty through without anybody being able to veto it. And it has become such a powerful tool that even the governments that have not ratified it are very reluctant to use landmines because landmines have become so stigmatized.
So it was a very successful campaign.
Yes.
Yeah. So you also have written that no one can justify a war crime by contending that the other side committed war crimes too. Yet we have seen unconditional support from the US and many European states for Israel government, despite clear evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, apartheid, and arguably genocide. How do you explain this enduring double standard?
Well, first let me start with your initial point, which is to say that what Hamas did on October 7th, 2023 was a blatant war crime. You cannot justify killing civilians. You cannot justify abducting civilians. So, I'm upfront about that. But Hamas's war crimes do not justify Israel's war crimes. And when Israel comes in and indiscriminately bombs or attacks even military targets with predictably disproportionate harm to civilians, like by attacking hospitals, when it starves civilians, when it blocks humanitarian aid, these are all war crimes, none of which are justified by what Hamas did on October 7th. And that's just a basic rule of humanitarian law. You can't allow, war crimes by one side to justify war crimes by the other, because everybody claims that the other side commits war crimes. Suddenly you'd have no humanitarian law left. So that's a basic premise. Now, as you note, certain governments, foremost the US government or the German government, are nonetheless supporting what the Israeli government is doing. They're just closing their eyes to its war crimes. They're closing its eyes to its likely genocide. And there are reasons for this. In Germany's case, they think that this is the way to make amends for the Holocaust, even though by endorsing Netanyahu's obliteration of human rights standards, Germany actually makes Jews around the world more endangered because it undermines the human rights standards that protects people around the world, not just Jews, but everybody else. In the case of the United States, this is actually not about American Jews, most of whom are opposed to what Netanyahu is doing. It's more about Trump and his backers, the far-right backers, principally Christian evangelicals, who support Israel, whatever it does, because it sees the existence of Israel as a prelude to the second coming of Christ. What this has in common is that none of these people are worried about the lives of Palestinian civilians. They're just jettisoning the rights of Palestinians. And, if you create an Israel exception to human rights standards, you harm human rights standards across the board. And that's where we are right now. Now, the good news is that most of the world is appalled by what Israel is doing. And we've seen condemnations by the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. We've seen charges by the International Criminal Court. We've seen rulings by the International Court of Justice. But there is broad outrage and condemnation of what Israel is doing. But so long as Trump continues to send arms and military aid to Israel, Netanyahu feels that he can proceed despite this broad opposition. And so that's where we are. We need to get Trump to change. And as I've written, I actually think that it's good that Trump wants the Nobel Peace Prize. That may sound laughable, but this is, he has this self-image of himself as a great negotiator. And he's not going to get a Nobel Peace Prize by large-scale ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which is what he's proposed so far. That's just a crime against humanity. He's going to get a Nobel Peace Prize, conceivably, if he persuades the Saudi government to normalize relations with Israel, which is going to require movement toward a Palestinian state. Now, that's not what Trump wants. Netanyahu is dead set against it. But we've seen that Trump is able to say no to Netanyahu when Trump sees his own self-interest at stake. So he forced Netanyahu to accept a short temporary ceasefire at the end of January. He has rejected Netanyahu's desire to bomb Iran, and he's negotiating with Iran. We need to get Trump to recognize that he's not going to be seen as a master negotiator in the case of Israel-Palestine unless he pushes Netanyahu toward a Palestinian state. And I think one thing we've learned about Trump is that this is not a principled man. So Israel may depend on him now, but Trump can turn like that. All Trump really cares about is himself. And so our goal is to push him to realize that the goals that he wants personally will only come by forcing Netanyahu to accept what he doesn't want, which is a Palestinian state. Not endless occupation of Gaza, not endless apartheid, but rather movement toward the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people.
But would you believe that it's easier to get to Trump rather than to Biden earlier next year?
Yeah. I mean, Biden said the right things. He said, stop bombing Palestinian civilians, stop starving them. He was never willing to use his leverage. He was never really willing to stop the arms sales and the military aid, with the exception of the huge 2,000-pound bombs that Netanyahu was dropping in Palestinian neighborhoods, clear war crimes. But mostly Biden just gave Netanyahu a green light. Part of why Netanyahu was willing to ignore Biden is that he knew that the Republican Party was still there. And Netanyahu's support is really based in the Republican Party in the US. It's not in the Democratic Party. But Trump owns the Republican Party now. If Trump were to tell Netanyahu to do something, as, for example, happened with the temporary ceasefire, Netanyahu would have to do it. And so it's an irony of this. It's like, it was Nixon, a Republican, who was able to make peace with China because there was nobody to the right of him. And there's a similar dynamic now with Trump. So that doesn't mean it's easy to persuade Trump, but it does mean that Trump has more latitude than Biden did, because there's nobody to the right of Trump who's going to criticize him.
Okay, yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. But do you believe that in the near future, all the states that are aiding and abetting Israel with still sending arms, despite all the reports, the various reports from international organizations that clearly state that the weapons are being used to commit war crimes, do you believe that they will eventually the heads of states will be prosecuted by crimes of abetting and aiding the practice of genocide?
Well, I think we have to recognize that first, the International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan so far has charged Netanyahu and Gallant, the former defense minister, only with basically their starvation and deprivation strategy. He's not charged them yet for bombing. I hope he does. Clearly, there are relatively easy cases to make, such as the use of the 2,000-pound bombs to indiscriminately decimate neighborhoods. If he does that, then he could begin to look at aiding and abetting and charging people who are supplying arms. Now, I'd be surprised if he went backwards now and charged Biden. But if Trump continues to send arms to Israel despite ongoing bombing of civilians, Trump would be vulnerable to being charged with aiding and abetting war crimes. And there's an historical precedent for this. This is what I describe in the book, the treatment of former Liberian President Charles Taylor, who was convicted of sending arms to a rebel group in neighboring Sierra Leone, which committed atrocities. Taylor was convicted of aiding and abetting war crimes and sentenced to 50 years in prison, which he's serving now in a British prison. So there is this precedent, and I think we need to use it in the case of Gaza.
Even though, at least in my own opinion, I believe it's much more unlikely that Karim Khan prosecutes Trump eventually if he continues with this, since.
Well, yeah, I mean, the place where Trump is vulnerable today is in his imposition of sanctions on Karim Khan, which is outrageous. It's blatant interference with an independent institution of justice. Article 70 of the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court's guiding treaty, makes it a crime to threaten or intimidate a court official because of their duties. And that's exactly what Trump has done. So, I don't know if Karim Khan's going to do this, but he would be entirely within his right to prosecute Trump for obstruction of justice. And we'll have to see if that happens.
2021, under your guide, the Human Rights Watch concluded that had a report and published a report which concluded that Israel was committing the crimes against humanity of persecution and apartheid. You identified three key elements like intent to dominate a racial, ethnic, or national group, Semitic oppression, and human acts to enforce the domination. Could you elaborate how these criteria were met and how did your team and you elaborated this report?
Yes. As we made clear with that report, we were not making an historical analogy to South Africa, but rather we were applying international law, namely the UN Convention on Apartheid and the International Criminal Court Treaty, both of which define apartheid. And we analyzed it and found the key element, really, which was oppressive discrimination. We found that that existed in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And so we found that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid in the occupied territory. We did this very carefully. It was a 200+ page report filled with facts, filled with careful legal analysis. And when we issued it, the Israeli government didn't know what to do with it. Their supporters said, oh, we're biased, we're anti-Semitic, but that was just name calling. That didn't do anything. And indeed, this understanding of Israeli apartheid has prevailed. And other groups, really every serious human rights group that has looked at the issue, has found that Israel was responsible for apartheid. So that has been significant. I think we were driven to it initially because when we would point out this oppressive discrimination, the traditional answer was, oh, don't worry, there's the peace process. But the peace process is moribund. The peace process is going nowhere. You can't cite this non-existent process to justify what is today apartheid. So this has significance in terms of the options before the Israeli government, because how do you end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Trump had said, oh, just get rid of the Palestinians, but that's a massive crime against humanity. That's not going to happen. One option would be to recognize that the settlements are so advanced that it isn't even possible to create a Palestinian state. There's a one-state reality, as people call it, and everybody should have equal rights within that one-state reality. But the Israeli government will never go along with that because they're roughly the same number of Jews and Arabs in that territory. And Israel doesn't want to lose its demographic majority. So Israel's preference is endless occupation. But what we've shown is that that's apartheid. And what that means is that the last option, the least bad option, is a two-state solution. Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace as states. And I hope that the apartheid reporting that Human Rights Watch and our colleague organizations have done pushes the world to recognize that endless occupation is not an option. And they need to push Israel to accept a Palestinian state.
Yes, it's true. But as we have seen, even the ICJ advisory opinions, which clearly stated that the settlements are completely illegal and a blatant violation of international law. Even with those decisions, we have seen that the Israeli policy is still increasing settlements, so on and so forth, specifically in West Bank, almost pertaining to ethnic cleansing, as we have seen.
No, you're right. And the International Court of Justice, in essence, found apartheid as well. It didn't use that precise language, but if you read the advisory opinion, it basically did. At this stage, why does Israel just ignore these judicial rulings? Because they have Trump's support. They Netanyahu has calculated that he can ignore the rest of the world because Trump keeps sending arms and military aid. And that's why we need to make this an issue in the United States. And it actually was in the last presidential campaign. I think Kamala Harris was hurt by her unwillingness to take a stronger position on Israel than Biden did. But the key is to switch Trump. And, as I noted, Trump's inclination is just to greenlight whatever Netanyahu wants. But, Trump is all about himself. And I think our task is to make him recognize that he's not going to achieve his goal of being seen as a master deal maker by continuing to endorse Netanyahu, who's determined never to have a deal with Palestine. So that's got to be our strategy. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's the best thing we can do.
But do you think that work is being done by organizations?
I think groups are trying to do that now. And I've written about this repeatedly in various forums. And so I think this is the best strategy we have. I don't pretend it's an overnight phenomenon, but I think we have to kind of work with the power structures that are there and recognize that there could be an advantage to Trump given that he does have leverage over Netanyahu and on certain occasions has been willing to say no to Netanyahu. We just need to raise the stakes and get Trump to, adopt the right position, contrary to his current desires, on the idea of a Palestinian state.
And pertaining to the South Africa versus Israel regarding the commission of genocide in Gaza, in your opinion, do you believe that all the legal requirements are met for the crime of?
Yeah, I do think Israel's committing genocide in Gaza. It's a slightly different question as to what will the International Court of Justice rule. And the reason is that it has pretty bad jurisprudence on this question. Genocide requires, in essence, two things: acts and intent. Now, in terms of acts, it's pretty straightforward. Israel has killed enough people. It probably has killed, call it 30,000 conservatively, Palestinian civilians. 8,000 were killed in Srebrenica, and that was found to be genocide. Similarly, you can commit genocide by imposing on people conditions designed to make life unlivable. That's what Netanyahu's starvation and deprivation strategy is. 2 months now of total blockade. So I think on the act side, it's pretty straightforward. The issue is going to come down to intent. There are really two ways to prove intent. One is through official statements, and there have been some. There's been former Defense Minister Gallant's statement that everybody in Gaza is a human animal. There is President Herzog's statement that there are no uninvolved civilians in Gaza. So these are genocidal statements. But there, of course, are other statements by Israeli officials that, claim to abide by the Geneva Convention. So you would get a battle of statements. And in the sense, the real issue is going to come down to, can you infer intent from conduct? Can you show that the way Israel is behaving in Gaza shows that it has genocidal intent? And this is where the court's jurisprudence is bad, because it has ruled that you cannot infer intent unless it's the only possible inference. And it's not, because the court is assuming genocide as the end. It's thinking about the Holocaust. It's thinking about the Rwandan genocide, where, the point after a certain stage was to kill every Jew, to kill every Tutsi. But genocide can also be a means. And I think the best way to understand this to begin with is in the Rohingya situation, which is also a case before the court, which will be decided before the Gaza case. And the Myanmar military killed about 30,000 Rohingya for the purpose of forcing 730,000 to flee to Bangladesh. So genocide there was a means toward the end of forced deportation. And that, I think, is the best way to understand what Israel is doing in Gaza. They're not trying to kill every single Palestinian civilian. They're trying to kill enough of them to send everybody fleeing into the Sinai. And it would be ironic and wrong for Israel to be able to say that their defense to genocide is the commission of a huge war crime and crime against humanity. Forced deportation should not be a defense to a charge of genocide. That's where the current jurisprudence lies. I think the court will have to change its jurisprudence in the Rohingya case, which in turn would make it possible to rule that Israel is responsible for genocide in Gaza.
So you think that we can infer that with the ruling in the Rohingya ruling?
The Rohingya ruling,
that's
the key. That's the key. The original ruling was in a case called Croatia versus Serbia. And I think the court has just got to say we made a mistake there and use the Rohingya case to acknowledge that mistake.
Yeah, very interesting. We'll be watching, I believe, all of us. Yeah. So, after decades in front of human rights organizations and in front of the human rights fighting, what advice would you give to young lawyers and aspiring advocates who want to follow a similar path?
Well, I think the main lesson I try to promote in the book is that there is always a way to pressure an abusive government. There's always an angle. There's always some way that defenders of human rights have leverage. And you just have to examine a situation. It could be dealing with the government's reputation. It could be trying to deprive the government of international benefits that it wants. It could be trying to, threaten government officials with prosecution. There's always something. And the key is to analyze the situation, to collect the information of what's going on, and to deploy that in a way that is the maximum chance of forcing the government to change. But what I've shown in the book by deliberately taking on the most difficult cases and showing that even there we could make a difference, I want people to recognize that regardless of the situation, there is something that can be done.
One more thing, regarding universal jurisdiction, do you believe it will be the key to prosecute international crimes instead of the ICC itself? Because we have seen that the ICC at this moment has, I believe one case ongoing in court. He's been known not to prosecute a lot of people. So do you believe that universal jurisdiction will be the key to fighting impunity?
Yeah, I view universal jurisdiction as a supplement to the International Criminal Court, not a replacement of it. The International Criminal Court, just by virtue of its limited capacity, aims for the most senior officials responsible for atrocities. And universal jurisdiction allows national governments to go after lesser officials who the ICC will never be able to pursue. That's what happened in Koblenz, Germany, when national prosecutors using universal jurisdiction convicted a man who was overseeing a torture center. That was a very important step. France has now used universal jurisdiction to charge Assad. So I think these are important supplements. It certainly is necessary when the ICC does not have jurisdiction, say in China. But even when it does, it's a way to supplement what the ICC does. So I don't view them as antagonistic. I view them as very much supplementary.
Thank you very much, Ken.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, your book was very interesting also. I read it, so...
Oh, fantastic. I hope the listeners will pick up a copy.
Yeah, for sure. Bye.